you had asked me how I got into doing the history of the language, and I started, say, before the phone rang. Well, that was just fortuitous because Prentice Hall acquired Appleton Century Croft in the 1970s, and I had been doing readings for one of the editors at Prentice Hall, and he simply asked me what the prospects were of updating Baugh's History of the English Language, which was originally published in 1935, second edition in 1957. The first edition was done when a book could be called A History of the English Language because there weren't any other one-volume histories of the English language. I had studied the history of the English language from Baugh's book and had great respect for it. The editor said that probably the old man would not be interested in a new edition, but give him my thoughts and he would pass them on. And as it turned out, Baugh liked the thoughts that I had for revising, updating the book. My family and I paid him a visit in Philadelphia to get to know him. He was a very formal man, and that was interesting too. He was so much older than any of the senior professors that I knew. He greeted us in his house on Spruce Street wearing a three-piece suit and a wing collar and a bow tie, and it was just like being transported to another age. And so we hit it off, and I came back to Austin, did a revision of one of the chapters that needed it the most, English in the 19th century and after, sent it to him, and he said that he would really like for me to be the co-author rather than just reviser. And of course I was happy to become the co-author of the book that I'd learned the history of the English language from, and we worked happily during the next year or two, bringing out the third edition that was published in '78, and I've kept it in print with new editions since then.
And speak to the, I mean, I made this statement earlier, maybe you could make it in your own words, the extent of the book, that this is the, well, like you said a moment ago, this was the first single volume history of the English language. And then it has been in print for 70-something years, and it is still the standard, as I understand it, for undergraduate, college. Well, something that kind of puts all those things together in a sentence or two.
Right. There are certainly other worthy competitors, and there are two or three that might sell as well as Baugh does. Baugh Cable now, I should say. Well, maybe there are two, but I, of course, don't have access to the sales of other books directly, but my impression is that it's one of the top 2 or 3 histories of the English language used in North America, and my firm impression is that it's the book that's used most widely in Europe and Asia. I'm almost certain of that. It's a standard whenever I go to Europe or to Asia. That's what I'm known for, is the co-author of this book, more so than this work that I have more of a direct passion for, poetry, because I feel I can make a new contribution in poetry. I must say, for the history of the English language, and so I feel a bit of a fraud for your purposes, I'm simply a summarizer and popularizer of what experts have done on the various topics in the language. And so I survey all of the scholarship that has been done over the past 8 or 10 years whenever I do a new edition. I find it fascinating reading, but usually I haven't made any original contribution myself to these. I summarize, popularize. I hope I don't vulgarize what others have said with more authority.
I understand and appreciate the humility in that distinction and the accuracy in that distinction at the same time. That's what it takes to get this huge field channeled into something where people can get their mind around it, right? So it's a very important service, and I'm certainly grateful for you having done that. So, having talked about the book, let's step back a bit to some more of your specific discoveries about English in your own learning process that were exciting or interesting to you. What was it? Let's take the number one. What was the thing that when you just your first jaw drop, as it were?
I have mixed emotions about this because if I tell you what really surprises me, most people think that it must be a joke, and that is what happened to silent E, the final E. Now that sounds like a very specific technical problem. In fact, I remember that, if I'm remembering right, David Lodge begins his novel Small World at an academic conference in which the speaker is talking about Middle English final E, and just the mention of this is supposed to be funny. Well, I don't think it's funny. It's something that has absorbed me to realize how the rhythm of the language has changed, and certainly the rhythm of the poetry from Chaucer's time through the 15th century. So I really get excited reading poets who are struggling with this changing language, changing in two drastic ways after Chaucer. The loss of this final syllable, and that might sound very minor, but believe me, it makes a great difference in the rhythm of the language. And at the same time, what in retrospect we call the great vowel shift was going on in the 15th century. All of the long vowels were shifting, generally upward, or if they were already high, they became diphthongs. This is what sets English apart from other European languages that are related. They didn't undergo a great vowel shift, but the long vowels in English are simply different from those in Italian, German, French, Spanish, because of what happened, especially during the 15th century, with reflexes that went on through the 16th and 17th centuries. So I would say those very specific technical matters that happen between Middle English and modern English are topics that fire my imagination and that cause me to want to spend hours poring over texts in the library to understand exactly how this transition came about. And of course, it has implications for your topic in spelling.
Yeah, so you said a lot there. Let's go back and unpack some of that. Let's explain the great vowel shift and anything that you know about competing theories as to what was driving it.
Well, that's an interesting question as well, because it was Otto Jesperson in the early part of the 20th century who, in retrospect, called it the great vowel shift. Obviously, the speakers during the 15th century didn't call it the great vowel shift. But in retrospect, we can see a pattern. The verb ride, that we say now with the diphthong, was pronounced by Chaucer read. And so that changed. The verb, the noun, the adjective grain for green is now pronounced green. There was a systematic shift upward. And there are theories that dispute how this happened that are really more technical than we need to get into. But the effect on the language and on the spelling system obviously was profound, as was the loss of the final E. I didn't do that as fluently as I wanted to.
There was some jewels in there. This is fascinating. So the vowel shift. Now, when does this start to happen?
Chaucer died in the year 1400. Shortly after Chaucer's death, in different parts of England, in different socioeconomic groups, as we'd call them now, among people of different generations, there was a gradual change. Usually change happens between generations. It's not the case that someone in her 60s will change the way she's always said a vowel. But children learning the language will, for whatever reason, make changes. Maybe they misperceive what they're hearing. Maybe, as children always like to do, they just want a new fashion. They want to have their own way of speaking. So the change happens between generations, as I said, at different rates in different parts of England. And it went on for over a century, for 2 centuries. Alexander Pope in the early 18th century could still rhyme our word for tea, tay, a cup of tea, tay, with obey. Shakespeare had what we call centralized diphthongs, something more like what you would hear in Toronto or North Carolina, oat and a boat and royd and hoy. So these changes happened over a period of time, and the effects on the spelling were profound, whether they were disastrous or not can be argued, and I can get into that later if you like. Some people say that the current spelling system is about as ideal as we can have because it shows the alternations that happened historically. But
yeah, it is a different kettle of fish.
That's a different kettle of fish.
Given the time, is there some connection between the emergence of the written standard and the vowel shift? They seem to be occurring relatively close to one another.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the vowel shift and the establishment of a written standard happened about the same time because Caxton introduced printing into England in 1476. And this was right in the middle of this upheaval in the long vowels. And just by virtue of printing hundreds or thousands of copies of the same text, there's going to be standardization willy-nilly. But the vowel shift continued. So the language continued to change even after printing imposed some standard forms. And of course, there were people in the next century who were very much aware of this and wanted to effect some kind of reform, and like most reforms, they didn't get very far.
When I say standard, though, we're talking about 2 different levels of standardization. First being, what King Henry V and the scribes bring in, and then second, the printing press. So it's 2 different thumps to the standardization stepway or stairway. And what you're describing with the great vowel shift seems to be happening almost in between them and really kicking as the printing press is coming in.
Right.
Yeah, that seems like here, English language has been around a long time, and that this shift seems to happen right in between these 2 seems beyond mere coincidence. I don't mean to impose something that, I don't know what I'm talking about here, but it seems interesting that they would all be so compacted together in this 50, 70 year span, given the...
Yeah, there could be historical forces here that I have just missed. You've talked to John Fisher and Malcolm Richardson about Henry V and the changes that came about around the year 1420 with his scribes, slightly more than 100 trained scribes who were standardizing the language. And then Caxton toward the end of the century, 1476, bringing in the printing press. I see, always have seen, just historical accident and coincidence. If there is a causal direction, I can't see it. I'd be very interested if someone could say that A affected B, but the main change, the main effect that I can see is that the language was frozen in mid-step, especially with Henry V and his scribes, and then even more later in the century with Caxton.
Yeah. So there's this. Yeah. And I'm going to drop this now, but the point that I was playing with here is that we have the scribes kicking in and English becoming a dramatically more widely used written language.
Right.
Right? It's going from being, as Fisher called it, a patois or
A patois,
a kind of peasant language without writing corresponding to it in some way, to being the language of the country, the written language of the country, slowly but surely.
For reasons I'm sure that you've already reviewed with Fisher or other people, that is that England had French imposed on it for a century and a half to 2 centuries, and both French and Latin were the languages of learning, so English really had to establish itself as a worthy competitor, and arguments in favor of English happened especially during the 16th century. So it wasn't clear that English could compete in science and the arts and literature, but there were passionate defenders of the English language at this time, and they argued for the use of English instead of Latin or French.
Yeah, I had the sense, and by the way, don't worry about any redundancy. We'll filter that.
Okay.
If there's anything about any aspect of this, don't worry that somebody may have covered it. Let's cover it again.
Okay.
And we'll decide whether or not
edit it, yeah.
we'll blend them together in a way that has the most amount of power. But relative to this window here, though English doesn't radiate into these more artistic or social uses for a while, the Chancery and King Henry V make it the official written language, right? And then because it becomes the official written language and more people are using it and more people in order to ascend to power have to use it and all of that, it also seems like as the English were breaking away from the French, there was a kind of nationalistic leaning to wanting a language other than the French.
Exactly.
That the king was playing into and using it this way.
Right.
Can you speak to that point?
And I think that happened earlier than Henry V. I think these nationalistic feelings were manifested in the early part of the 14th century and continued through the 14th century. John Gower, Chaucer's friend, wrote in Latin, French, and English. Chaucer, of course, wrote in English in the 1380s, 1390s, the end of the 14th century. There was a nationalistic feeling growing through the 14th century and certainly crystallized by Henry V, who crystallizes our notion of English patriotism during this period. Apparently he went to France and wrote letters home to his wife in English, and I think that that's sometimes taken as like watershed use in English, and certainly his chancery scribes were important in standardizing English.
Right. It's almost like he tapped into a national desire to, cease being French in the official language, and made it possible for people to start doing what they wanted to do but didn't know how to do.
Exactly. Let me transpose our discussion several centuries later to make some analogies, and then we can come back to the Middle Ages if you like. Because there are clear parallels in this nationalistic feeling between England in the 14th and 15th centuries and the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the former British Empire and Commonwealth, the new nations of the 20th century, Anglophone nations who have this colonial heritage. For Webster, patriotism was a driving force, and he was passionate about the need for an American language. And his 1828 dictionary was called An American Dictionary of the English Language. This, of course, was related to spelling reform, which Webster embraced only slowly. Benjamin Franklin had written a scheme for a reformed spelling and new mode of writing as early as 1768. And Franklin tried to persuade Webster that this was a way to go, but Webster was a stick in the mud. He rejected Franklin's ideas first from his usual sense of superiority and condescension, saying, well, Dr. Franklin, of course, is a self-educated man. He doesn't pretend to great learning, and pretty much dismissed these ideas that Franklin had. And it wasn't until 15 years later that Webster began to understand the need for paying attention to spelling. And in fact, it's to his credit that when he recognized this, he said flatly, I was wrong, and Franklin was right. We need to reform the spelling. Of course, this feeds into the nationalistic feeling, incidentally. However, in embracing the need for reform at that time, he went too far and proposed alterations to the spelling that met great resistance. And he would want to spell any long E sound, for example, with a double E. So if you've got meat for what's on the table, that should be spelled M-double-E-T, and so on. He wanted to drop all silent E's, back to my topic about final E in the 15th century. So he was too extreme. These ideas were rejected, but when he finally came to write his first small dictionary of the English language, a compendious dictionary of the English language, he retracted some of these over-the-top proposals, and his ideas of spelling reform were more modest. And in fact, many of those have stayed with us. Theater and center spelled ER instead of RE. Dropping the U in color and honor. Spelling check, C-H-E-C-K instead of C-H-E-C-Q-U-E. Defense with an S instead of a C. I think the only place where he proposed a change that didn't catch on, again, was with the final E, spelling determine without the final E, D-E-T-E-R-M-I-N. But otherwise, what he came up with in his first small dictionary seemed logical, modest, workable, and with a few changes. That's essentially what he kept for his great dictionary of 1828, and those, of course, have been staples of American spelling ever since.
That was a fascinating recount. In my search on particularly the relationship between Franklin and Webster, my understanding was Franklin focused on the alphabet.
Right.
Right? He thought the way to get to correspondence was to change the alphabet, not to try to change this, which implied changing the spelling,
right.
But it was different than leaving the alphabet alone and fixing the spelling. And that he didn't get anywhere.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But that he did ultimately influence Webster, who dedicates the preface to his work later to Franklin. Mm-hmm. And that I'm not even sure the source of this myth, but that Webster, after, kind of on his deathbed, I think he'd accomplished changing 50 word spellings or something like that, and came to believe that Franklin was right in the long run. There was no way to fix this thing without changing the alphabet itself.
Actually, I didn't realize that.
That may not be true.
No,
there's a lot of myths.
You're probably right. Yeah, that sounds plausible. I do know that Webster was so fired up about when he finally decided that the language had to be reformed, he would go around to printing houses and get the teenage boys who were setting type and give them a list of words, tell them how the word should be spelled. There was one man who was recounting this toward the end of the 19th century, and he was saying, when I was a 13-year-old boy, this small, pale-faced man came into the office and said, "Lad, take this list and spell these words this way. Center, C-E-N-T-E-R, theater, T-H-E, with them." And obviously, he had his effect. He didn't simply write his dictionary. He went around and campaigned for these changes.
He's an activist.
An activist in spelling.
Yeah, that's remarkable. There's a book that I forget the name of the woman that wrote it, somewhere at Yale or Harvard, in which she recounts this scene of Webster carrying this flag, marching down some parade route, and the flag has got all this different symbology on it, but that it represented Webster as this fiery reformist activist whose position was, this is a problem.
Yeah.
This orthography thing is a problem.
Yeah.
And it ought to be a national priority.
Right.
And that our failure to consider this thing a national priority will, and his words were, doom
Yeah. Yeah.
Future generations.
Patriotism drove Webster. Yeah.
And he saw the future of the country connected to language.
Exactly.
Excellent. So we're going to
By the way,
please.
It's interesting to then fast forward ahead to the newly emergent nations and see that they're struggling in all aspects of the English language to incorporate what was a colonial heritage into their independent culture. And you can find very eloquent mixed statements on this subject. For example, by the former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who said, sometimes I weep to think that I am more fluent in English than in Chinese. And Nehru, Nasser, others had these mixed feelings about the colonial heritage.
Yeah, about being on the other end of the imperialism of English.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yet during these historical accidents, the unfolding of history, was anyone ever in the mindset that English would become as widespread as it is?
That's an interesting question. Did anyone realize that English would become what we now call a world language? And that phrase, which is now fairly common in college level courses, English as a world language. We have a course at Texas called English as a World Language. I would say that even 30 years ago, when English was clearly becoming the dominant language for so many global uses, that you just didn't find books written on English as a world language. And there's been a proliferation of scholarship and study on this subject during the past 30 years. Certainly one of the most exciting areas of the history of the English language. But in answer to your question, no, I think even by the middle part of the 20th century, people didn't understand the far-reaching implications of English as a global language. English worldwide. These are phrases that are the names of journals now.
To some degree, that's caught up in the fact that people didn't envision a world in which language would have that kind of universality anyway, right?
Exactly.
And then
world.
secondly,
Right.
particularly, it's about English, but it's generally about not envisioning a world where there would be such continuity by virtue of a language.
Yeah, the world has changed. Obviously, the world has changed technologically, electronically, and just because of conquests and settlement patterns of several years ago, several hundred years ago, English and Spanish benefit from the changes in the world. And when I grew up in Texas, I had a choice in high school of studying Latin or Spanish, and it seemed that Latin was what I should study, and then in college study French. And this was not that long ago. Now I live in a bilingual state. I'm sorry that I never studied Spanish. I think I will the next time around.
There you go. Okay. Let's step back a bit. I'm going to ask some questions that you may or may not be able to answer, and that's fine. I want to talk about the early history of the English language. Where does it come from? And And paralleling that, I want to stop in at times and check in on literacy. So imagine a time scale.
Sure.
Go back as far as you want to.
We'll take it from the beginnings. Since I teach a course in the history of the English language, I often begin the course by asking my students, when did the English language begin? And so they scratch their heads. Was there a committee meeting to establish English? Well, no. English language began probably in the year 449, if we want to take the Venerable Bede's date, when certain Germanic warriors, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, crossed to England to give aid to the besieged Britons, the Celtic people who had been under the protection of the Roman Empire for several centuries. So I say the English language began, call it April the 17th, 449, when these Germanic warriors got in their boats on the north shore of Germany, modern-day Germany or Denmark, and that morning they were speaking West Germanic. When they arrived in England, they were speaking English just by convention. It is the Germanic language that is spoken in English. Now, clearly they understood their brothers and cousins back on the continent for a number of decades, but since the world has changed, as we were just saying, there wasn't the kind of instant communication between England and the continent, and communities apart would develop their languages in their different ways. And so what became first a dialect eventually became mutually unintelligible. For a while, there of course were relations with the Vikings, who liked to come down during the Anglo-Saxon period in the 8th and 9th centuries and attack the coastal towns and harry and plunder and raid and burn. And there was mutual intelligibility to some extent between Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse. They could stand on either side of a river and shout insults at each other and probably be understood. Now, Old Norse is a North Germanic language. Old English is what we classify in retrospect as a West Germanic language, more closely related to modern German and Dutch and Frisian. The Scandinavian languages we hang off of a different branch, but that's the beginning. And England was a country of, as we identify now, 4 or 5 Anglo-Saxon dialects, and we can study the manuscripts and see the different dialects. There was a move towards standardization, especially in Winchester in the South, but of course all moves towards standardization in Anglo-Saxon were interrupted by the Norman conquest in 1066, and so that changed the story of English, and just as it changed the history of the country. But as a result of the Norman conquest, far-reaching changes happened, and not so much at first. It was really when, in the 13th century, the French had to decide whether they were French or English, and if they were French, they would go back to France. If they were English, they would stay in England. Those who stayed had to learn English, and it was at that late point that French words began to come into the English language by a process that just seems logical and natural. A native speaker of French reaching for a word that might or might not have been in the Anglo-Saxon culture would use the word that that person knew. So it was especially as England and France were dividing again that all of these new words came into the language.
So up to that point, there was a stratification. English did what English did, French did what French did, but
there was a stratification,
as they separated,
yeah, exactly,
and English had to now carry the whole world.
English now had to carry the whole burden. There was a stratification that was permeable at the borders, so that there were, the peasants just spoke English, but there were English speakers who could speak French, and there were French speakers who could speak English. So between these two strata, there was a kind of middle ground a Norman might marry an English woman, and obviously the household would be in some ways bilingual.
Let's go back. You mentioned back in the 800s or so, before the Norman conquest, obviously, that we have manuscripts that give us some sense of the pronunciation or dialects that were in play. So that presupposes that we're writing.
Right.
And let's talk about, where does English writing begin as distinct from the English, I mean, what I'm hearing is that there were these, once protected by the Romans, early Brits, that get kind of mixed up with the German warriors coming over. Yeah. And prodded by the Vikings and other people from the north, and all this is kind of this soup kettle.
Exactly. It was a soup kettle, except that the Britons, and this is spelled Britons, these are the Romanized Celts. And as you know from the modern history of the British Isles, the Britons got pushed by the Anglo-Saxons to the extremities of England and to Ireland. So in the far southwest, Cornish, what we now call Cornish, was spoken. Welsh, Scottish, Irish. So that these Celtic speakers, curiously, had little effect in terms of the size of the vocabulary and new lexical items on the language that the Anglo-Saxon conquerors spoke. They incorporated mainly place names, river names, but not so many words from the Celtic languages of the time.
So, the writing system. When does writing? I mean, we know. Speak to there's the church is the first.
Yeah. So we can say in 597, Saint Augustine, not the famous Saint Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, but the English Saint Augustine began to convert or reconvert England to Christianity, and with that came a writing system that, for the most part, supplanted the writing system that had been in effect, which was the Futhark alphabet. And there are a few letters that are worked into Old English from the Futhark, the Germanic alphabet, but essentially it was an alphabet and a writing system that came from the church. And so English during the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries was spelled using the Latin alphabet.
You just pronounced the Futhark, is that what you called it?
Yeah, it's...
how's this related to the runic alphabet?
Same
thing.
The runes, yeah.
All right, I just wanted to make sure that, because I haven't heard that term before. Okay. So, and King Alfred plays a role, right? The first kind of British ruler to start using writing in a way that would precipitate something of a standard that would later get disrupted, as you mentioned.
Yeah, certainly. King Alfred was important for the linguistic system, the language at the time, by authorizing the translation of the Bible into West Saxon, the Gospels into West Saxon. Probably even more important than these projects that he sponsored was the fact that makes the difference in language supremacy throughout the ages and above all others, and that is he was a very adept military leader. And so under his leadership, the English were able to repulse and to confine the Norse invaders to East Anglia. And if the Treaty of Wedmore had not happened in 878, if that had not been a result of Alfred the Great's battles against the Danes, then there's a possibility that the language in the British Isles would have been a descendant of Old Norse, Danish, say, and that English as a world language now would be Danish. It's just staggering to imagine that.
Like changing the soup stock.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, changing the soup stock. The different fortunes of Danish and English. Yeah.
So there again, we could say that one of the connective links in the entire story comes down to, how well this king defends his territory and preserves and extends the scope of this incubation of what would become the English language.
Yeah, kings always have more influence than poets and scholars. Kings and presidents always have more influence. Obviously, the person who had the single most influence on the English language was not Shakespeare, it was William the Conqueror.
Talk about that.
Well, it just shows that it shows several things. To think about William the Conqueror, it shows that a language prevails not because of any intrinsic merit in the language itself, not any intrinsic merit in its lexical stock or in its spelling system or in its syntax. It prevails by brute force, and generally this has to do with military conquest. So that during the period that the Normans ruled England, the English language was changed in far-reaching ways. And if we were to make up a list of the 10 people who have most influenced the English language, I've already named Shakespeare and the translators of the King James Bible, William Tyndale, Miles Coverdale. One could then begin to think about whether to name Chaucer or Dr. Johnson or Noah Webster. It's hard to think of individuals who could change a language of this size, so baggy and spreading and shapeless. But one person really had an effect on it, more than Henry V, and that was William the Conqueror. I'd say he had the greatest effect on the language by the imposition of French. And it could be that whatever future, for good or bad, the English language is going to have in various parts of the world now will be the result of George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld. It's just the way.
In terms of its continuing global extent.
Global extent and expansion.
Not necessarily in terms of its internal changes.
No, I don't think people are going to begin saying nuclear because the president says nuclear.
Right. But in the case of William the Conqueror, he interrupts an evolutionary process still in the cauldron. And so it affects not only its extent for a while, it affects how the soup's cooking, doesn't it? I mean,
let's back up a minute to say that William the Conqueror interrupts an evolutionary process still in progress. Of course, the language has always been changing, and certainly from the time English began on April 17th, 449, if that's when it was, through the period of recorded Old English up to Chaucer and beyond. Yes, there was an interruption of the evolution by William the Conqueror, but the language has been evolving constantly. Now, having said that, clearly the development of the language has slowed down in the past century, 2 centuries, mainly because of mass media, so that you can read a newspaper from Sydney, Australia, and a newspaper from London, a newspaper from Boston, and you can read for several sentences or paragraphs and not have any clue as to the location of this international form of English. So you're right, he did interrupt an evolutionary process or changes, but then the language had just been changing constantly, just as West Germanic had changed from Germanic and just as Germanic had changed from Indo-European. So change, the language has never been pure. It's never, until recently, it's never been stable, and it's had stability.
Right. The global extent of the media creates a new kind of conservatism or conservatism in what's changeable. Changing tapes? Okay.
Let me ask if my posture and voice are okay.
You sound great.
I'm open to...
I keep looking over here. Good. Just because we just came through this space, I want to take this and do a couple of readings, and I'll put that behind us as we move on to other things, just to have it as a reference.
Have it, yeah. All right.
So what we want, we probably wouldn't play a whole paragraph. What we want to do is to create some kind of a, first of all, a statement from you about the phoneticism, about the correspondence in just before the Norman invasion, the correspondence that was there.
Yeah.
Describe why there was a correspondence, the use of the additional runic alphabet components, and then do a reading that, imagine we've actually got text on.
Right.
So we can do a quick comparison between two different readings of the same text with two different alphabetic renditions of them. So those are the three parts in this space that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think I can hit most of those.
Good.
Right. So let me just say that, Old English was spelled more phonetically than Middle English, and there are some historical reasons for that. Mainly because Middle English was not an official dialect. After the imposition of Norman French, the dialects that were already a part of England went even further their separate ways and lost the standardization in the writing system that had been developing. There was no need to standardize a language that was not official. And so therefore, spelling in Middle English is widely divergent from one part of the country to another within one text, sometimes from the same word occurring in the text to another occurrence of the word.
Let's nail this point down. What you're describing is the influence on standardizing the way language is spoken that writing systems have. Yeah?
Right. Okay. So if we want to say that writing systems influence the way English was spoken, it did so in a specific way in the Middle English period because the official writing systems were French and Latin. And so therefore, since there wasn't any standardized English, both the writing systems and the dialects themselves diverged at a faster rate than they had before. So this is an effect of a writing system on the spoken language, a writing system that is official, supplanting the one that had been in place before. Now, before the Norman Conquest, English was, of course, spoken in different dialects in the north and in the Midlands in the south and in Kentish. But for any of these dialects, once you understand some of the very simple conventions in the writing system, it's possible to read the text off the page much more easily than it is to read 13th or 14th century Middle English, because there is wide variability in the spelling of the same sounds. So I can just give you an illustration of this, which, since there's no text being projected, you can consult a text at a later point for yourself. But this is a translation of Moses and the Red Sea, Exodus, chapter 14, which was done by the churchman Abbot Alfred around the year 1000. And I'll just read a couple of sentences, and in order to get into the drift of it, I'll read the gloss first, and then the original. And the gloss is just a word for word, modern English translation When Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, then sent the Lord great wind all the night, and turned the sea to dry land. And that water became in two divided, and lay a dry street through the sea. And the water stood on two sides of the street like two high walls. Then went all Israel's folk through the sea on the way which the Lord for them made. And they came whole and sound through the sea, as the Lord them promised. The way this sounded in Old English at about the year 1000 was this. Tha Moises a fenode his hand over tha sa, tha sinde drichten mitchell na wind, alle tha nicht, an je winde tha sa to drium, on that water werth on twa to dalid, on lay an drie strat durch tha sa. On that water stod on twa halva thera strata swilcha twean hea ja welas. Tha for alle Israel folk thur tha sa on thona way tha drichten him je warte. On tha kommen halla an je sunde thur tha sa swa drichten him beheit. Now, trust me, if you had the text, you would be able to read that as fluently as I did, because there's such a consistent one-to-one matching of sound and spelling. Things change by the 14th century. An even easier text to find would be the opening lines of the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales, and I'll just say a few of those lines. Find a text, follow along, and you'll see that although the vocabulary is more familiar, because many French words have now come into the language, whereas what I just read from Old English was wholly Germanic, except for some biblical terms, a completely Germanic vocabulary, and therefore strange to us, except for some of the words that have survived, like water for water and hand for hand. With Chaucer, there is an influence of the French wholesale incorporation of French vocabulary, so that the famous opening lines go like this. Juan that April with his shures sota, the drucht of March hath persed to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendred is the floor. One Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath, in spirit hath in every holt and hath the tendre croppus, and the youngest sonne hath in the ram his halve coursey runne, and smalle fooles mocken melodie, that slepen all the night with open ear. So pricketh him nature in her courages, than longen folk tog on pilgrimages, and palmers for to second straunge strondes, to furna always couth in sundry landes, and specially from every shearers inde of Engelon to Canterbury thy winde, the holy blissful martyr for to sake that him hath holpen when that they were sake. Now, even though there is familiar vocabulary in that passage, I think it would be harder to get the pronunciation down just by looking at the spelling than to get the pronunciation down for the Old English that was written several centuries before.
Yeah, I would almost add that an alien coming down that was unfamiliar with English from any of these periods would find that the Old English was actually easier once you understood the key between letter and sound than Middle English or today's English.
Yeah, exactly. An alien coming down would have better luck buying mead in the shops in Anglo-Saxon England than buying shoes from Chaucer's family.
Yeah. I guess that works. One other thing, going back, your readings were fantastic. Thank you. Assuming that we do get a copy of the transcript, right, of both of the version that you have that you read from your companion book, there's the use of letter conventions in there. Could you just imagine that there's a screen up now,
right?
And that as you're talking, we're circling letter combinations,
right,
and putting an arrow on them as you're speaking to illustrate them. Narrate over that to what we're seeing in this difference in the way letters are used with sounds, particularly the av and the thorn and whatever else occurs to you.
Right, so that the Latin alphabet served fairly well for Old English manuscripts of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, but there were some sounds that required adaptation or adoption from other systems. So the TH sound, there's both a voiced and a voiceless TH, the sound and the th sound, and you can hear the two of them in words like thigh and biblical thy, or thin and then. Those TH sounds, whether voiced or voiceless, were indicated by adaptations of the runic letters, and the two main ones that were used were the eth, what we call the eth, and the thorn, and those have both lowercase and uppercase representations, so that this passage starts with an uppercase thorn, an uppercase eth, which is a capital D with a bar through it. And so when you see that at the beginning of a word, you know that it's pronounced as the voiceless TH, tha. It's TH, the TH is in thin, tha. Other adaptations were what we call the AE digraph for the sound a that we have in modern English, cat. It so happens that the pronoun that, our pronoun that, pronounced almost the same way in Old English as that with a voiceless TH. That AE digraph indicates that the sound, the vowel, short vowels, is exactly the same for King Alfred as it is for us.
Great. Okay, let's leave this dimension behind. That was great. Thank you. Let's go back and go meta to the English language and to the mixing pot that's happening in the King Henry V time. By describing from your perspective, as whatever you're comfortable with, why A, Latin was dominant, and B, let's connect that to the story of the ascendancy of the French language in England.
The two official languages in England in the late Middle Ages were Latin and French. Latin, obviously, because it was the language of the church, and it was the international language of Europe. So in order to be able to communicate beyond the borders of England, in order not to be provincial, one needed to write in Latin. For obvious reasons, French was the language that had been imposed by the Norman conquerors. And so English was not an official language during this time. It's interesting that English did not become official in all aspects of life all at once. There was a series of adoptions of English for various functions in Parliament, in the schools, in the courts. So it's not as though French went from being the official language one day to the unofficial language the next. So there was a period of transition, including literature. Chaucer's friend John Gower wrote in French, Latin, and English. Chaucer wrote in English. So there was a period of transition during which English became the official language, and French, by the time of Henry V, had probably the kind of prestige that French has almost always had, a language of learning, of culture, certainly of the dinner table, because French cuisine demanded words that were not in Anglo-Saxon. French fashion demanded words that were not in Anglo-Saxon, because then, as now, French were leaders in these more elegant aspects of life. Certainly in literature, if you think of the words that we use in literature, including literature itself, and romance, and novel, and chapter. These words were just incorporated into the English language. Words for the government, including the word government itself, were incorporated into the language. So that by the time English became official in all these separate aspects of life in England, it had incorporated words that we would be loath to do without now.
So in some respects, you could say that English didn't have the vocabulary for where the culture was evolving, and it took the other vocabulary that was available to it to fill those gaps, and that got hybridized.
Right. The adequacy of a lexicon or a vocabulary to the needs of a people is an interesting question, because we tend to take a Eurocentric view and figure that there are primitive languages or third world languages that just can't express concepts that English, French, German, Russian, Chinese, Japanese can express. But obviously, any language is going to be adequate for the needs of its culture. Now, with the case of English in confrontation with French, since there were new dishes added to the dinner table in England, new names were needed to show how these dishes were prepared, to name the foods that were brought to the table. It's often said that going back to the peasants' use of English in the farmyard, that the names for the farmyard animals tend to be in Anglo-Saxon, and the names for the dishes tend to be in English. So you've got lamb and mutton, and so.
Right. But it isn't just that they invent a dish and then need to find a word for it. These dishes came from France, right?
Right.
So you became. That was just happened to be the name for the thing that didn't exist without the name for the thing, and the name for the thing was in French.
Exactly. Yeah. Roast. A way of preparing the meal. These methods of preparing meals were. But can we pause a minute and let me just
anytime.
Let me just refresh my memory actually on some of these.
Do you need to be free of the mic? You want me to get you
no,
a book?
I can.
I can get you a book if you want.
I think I can reach it here.
Yep.
It's
always a good reference book for this one.
Okay, I'll just, instead of plagiarizing somebody else, I'll plagiarize myself.
There you go. That's a safe one.
What I'm afraid I'm going to do is name a word that's native English. Well,
I think this is an important distinction, that it isn't like that it was some. I mean, I guess in some circles it may have been that, well, we want to be cool, so we're gonna, or what we might call today, let's be cool, so we'll use this.
Yeah.
This, when there's 7 different ways to describe an object.
Yeah.
Then you're picking based on your education and your affinities for, flair and all kinds of other things. But when the proper name of that object just happens to come in a different language, that's that.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That's an important distinction here.
Exactly, yeah.
I know that the Latin provided names for business and governmental functions that the English didn't have.
Right, both Latin and French did. Sometimes it's hard to know whether a word came directly from, well, it's hard to know off the top of your head whether it came directly from Latin or by way of French.
And obviously some degree of French is sitting on top of Latin too, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that's your point.
right. Okay, you're ready to continue?
Sure, whenever you are.
Yeah, so that for the dinner table in England, there were ways of preparing food that came from France. The words that we use for boil and stew and fry come from French. And so many of the items themselves, fruit, many kinds of fruit, including the word fruit itself, and raisin and so on. Confection, it's, I'm not doing very well on this. Anyhow, scratch that. Okay, well, I'll just read a couple of sentences from the book, and instead of trying to do it by memory. So you could have, as recapitulated in the history of the English language, pottage, gruel, toast, biscuit, cream, sugar, olives, salad, lettuce, endive, all of those French words, and for dessert, almonds and many fruits, including raisin, fig, date, grape, orange, lemon, pomegranate, cherry, peach, or a confection, pastry, tart, jelly. Among seasoning and condiments, we find spice, clove, thyme, herb, mustard, vinegar, marjoram, cinnamon, nutmeg, the verbs roast, boil, parboil, stew, fry, broach, blanch, grate, and mince describe various culinary processes, and goblet, saucer, cruet, plate, platter suggest French refinements in the serving of meals. As Baugh said when he wrote this in 1935, it is melancholy to think what the English dinner table would have been like had there been no Norman conquest.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I get that. So in that sense, the vocabulary growth has got this incredibly real, objective, practical trajectory going on in it.
Right. The vocabulary growth often serves a very practical function to name an item that was not in the language before. Sometimes it's superfluous. It names an item that was in the language before, and sometimes the native word, it often happens, the native word drops out in favor of the French word, even though they're naming exactly the same items.
Right, and so then we're talking about a difference in its, in some other character than just its naming function.
Right.
Yeah? Okay, good. Let me ask some questions about literacy, to whatever extent you're comfortable with this, because I'm trying to get multiple angles on this. What do you think the percentage of the English population was with respect to literacy in King Alfred's day? How many people read?
In King Alfred's day, I don't know what the proportion of the population would be, but it would be almost exclusively people sorry. Let me start over. In King Alfred's day, in the late 9th century, I don't know what proportion of the people would be able to read and write, but almost all of them in some way would have been associated with the church. So literacy was, I don't know why let me just start. Yeah, the past few days I'd had some congestion, but I think I'm just about over it.
Whatever you need, you want to
yeah. Well, I feel fine if my voice holds up. So let me try that again. Okay. Literacy in the Middle Ages was pretty much confined to the clergy. Even aristocrats, men and women in charge of large castles, might not be able to read. It was the church that was the source of most literacy. And not everyone within the church. One of the most familiar stories of an oral tradition is related to us by the great historian Bede in the 8th century, himself, of course, very literate and very much a churchman, recounting how in the late 7th century, an illiterate lay brother at a monastery named Cadman became the first poet to compose in English. But Cadman was unlettered. He was unable to write. So the poems that came to him and that he recited were transcribed by the monks at the monastery. So only a small proportion of people in both Anglo-Saxon and late medieval times could read. It didn't necessarily connect to higher socioeconomic status, because there could very well be the lord of a castle who could not read. But it was mainly the church.
Good. Which was connected to the church's power in a way, right?
Yeah, and again, the old story of power. In this case, the church had considerable power.
So let's fast forward to King Henry V's time, as we're transitioning back into English as a writing system. What can you say about the levels of literacy either in French in England or in the first decade or so of the emergence of English resurrecting as the written standard?
Again, I can't give you the figures on the increase in literacy, but one of the most familiar generalizations about the growth of literacy and about this period is that the 15th century saw an increase at a faster rate than earlier centuries had. And it's during this period that we see, the middle class always seems to be rising in whatever period you want to name, but especially there was more social mobility during the 15th century, and especially with the printing press making books become accessible to many, and the spread of education out of the church into the various communities and guilds. It was during this period that literacy increased at a faster rate than it ever had before in England. I can't give you the figures, but it was a period during which many people were delighting in composing poetry in English. People of an economic and cultural status that in earlier decades would not have been composing poetry. There were just a lot of very bad verse written during the 15th century by people who could suddenly do this, who were suddenly empowered. I wish I could give you some.
No, that's right.
Figures,
I'm not trying to pin you to anything,
yeah.
But something that Fisher once said, and it didn't come out very good on tape, that in the 15th century, maybe 5,000 people in all of England could read and write in English.
Is that right?
Yeah, and so I'm trying to hit that from many angles as I can to just show that this thing that's so important to us today isn't that old.
Yeah.
It hasn't been that long since hardly any of us were doing it.
Yeah, no, that's an important point, and I wish I had. In fact, if I could think of an easy source to go to, I would become a 2-minute expert on it and repeat that. But I can't think where I could go to give you any figures like that. I wish we can do it for the transcript later, but
okay. Clearly, we'll move past this point. Clearly, it was initially for the elite and trickled from there into the more and more of the middle class over a slow curve that really begins there with Henry V.
Yeah, and yeah, I know that Fisher gives a lot of prominence to Henry the Fifth. I just don't know how to trace the audience, say, from the last decades of the 14th century. Chaucer had some kind of audience to 20 years later, 1420, when Henry V was establishing a standardized English. But I think that's probably right, that's a kind of watershed moment. But I can't, if I thought of some information, if I could think of some information that
no problem.
could give you, I would, but I'm just drawing a blank.
Clearly there's a big difference between what's possible, how many people are reading before the printing press and how many people are after it.
Yeah.
That's across the boards.
Right, yeah.
All right, let's go to the sounds and letters, and then after that we're going to go into the printing press and the kind of accidents of history.
Right.
And do a little
Okay.
recounting of some of the more interesting stories and the accidents of history. One of the things that's most interesting about all this, from our perspective, where we're trying to bring the brain science and the history together to talk together, is that in the original writing systems, the Semitic, Phoenician, Greek, Roman use of the alphabet, there's this close correspondence between letters and sounds, which means the number of letters and the number of sounds are roughly the same. For whatever reason, we talked about that and we really can't go very far with it, English ends up with having more sounds than it's got letters for. And though in King Alfred's day and before the Norman invasion, they develop a writing system over the 300 or 400 years before that has a greater phonetic correspondence, as you spoke to. When the scribes come into play with King Henry V, Chancery scribes, they are now taking this expanded vocabulary, which now includes more French, obviously. The French words, the Latin words, the Anglo-Saxon words left over, all these things. And they're trying to spell all these sound variations with this very limited alphabet. We'll talk about what the printing press does as stage two. But how do they go about this? What are the consequences of these people? And again, this parenthetical pause to the taping process, but just say we're not trying to imply for our audience that these scribes kind of created this standard and handed it off to everybody. You shall use this now. But they created a way of doing things with the writing system that was what other people aspired to, that wanted to aspire to the power circle they were operating in.
Right.
Right? So it's in that sense that their conventions for spelling and for pronunciation and how those two combined using, connecting the English oral language with the Latin alphabet is at the ground of the written standard. And the process through which they do that is of real interest to us. What can we say about that?
Yeah, it is interesting that Anglo-Norman scribes imposed their conventions on English. There are parallels in history with this. When the Spanish conquerors tried to teach the Aztecs to become scribes, one eyewitness at the time said it was almost as though they had to stand behind them with whips to make them make distinctions that were phonemic in Spanish that were not phonemic in Nahuatl. And so this is always a problem because a phonemic transcription depends on the recognition of phonemes. And there's a different phonemic inventory in French and in English. And just as there were distinctions that Spanish made between sounds that were significant distinctions that were not made in Nahuatl, so with English and French. Another kind of parallel to that, just to induce some humility in thinking about the writing system, is that philologists who study the older stages of the language are studying a dead language, if you like, but they have infinite resources to decide what kind of mapping there was between letter and phoneme, if in fact there was a matching between letter and phoneme, or if there was a matching between letter and sounds that were different but not significantly. The only point I would make is that scholars in learned articles that wind through journals for years can't determine what the mapping was for many of the most crucial letter-phoneme matchings. And my thought is, if linguists, the people who have studied this in depth and who know the way language works and the way spelling systems work, with all the time in the world, can't construct an adequate matching of letter and sound, imagine how hard it would be for a child getting the fragmentary pieces of language that come to children. They're always corrupt, the parts of the language that children hear, incomplete. From that, they have to construct a grammar. So that's one point that I would make about the difficulty of perceiving a matching between the letter and the sound. Even though these linguists are dealing with a dead language, they have multiple resources, lots of time. It's what they do, and you still get endless debates about how this works. In English, there's just some absurdities in the effort to get consistency in the language. There was a time when the verb light, L-I-G-H-T, could justify the G-H. But by analogy, delight is spelled with a G-H, and it never had it in French, daily. So that there are lots of inconsistencies, absurdities, facts contrary to the etymology that show up in the writing system. It's a mess.
Let's go back to these scribes just to intersect on that point again. Again, somebody figured out how to pair up these Latin letters according to kind of Latin sounds to approximate English sounds they wanted them to represent. And these people that were doing it weren't people that were proud English language defenders. They were scribes that up until the point that this shift started to happen, lived in a Latin and French world for the most part, in terms of their mind, in terms of their sounds, the sounds that they were used to. Like you were making the analogy of the Spanish. I want to draw that out. I mean, but it seems to me, in my words, it would say, is we've got a small number of people working for a king who are forging the relationship between an inadequate number of letters and mapping them over to the sounds of a language they're not primary users of.
Right. Yeah.
And that seems incredibly significant.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I don't have much to add to what you just said about it. There's the matter of, and since I don't have anything to say about it, I won't try to say anything about it. But I would say there's also the matter of dialectal diversity, both within the United States in the present day and around the world. So that obviously there are different accents of English, there are different pronunciations of English, even if English is becoming homogenized among the middle and upper classes in the United States. Still, there are regional differences that can be identified, and the kind of stereotypical pak the ka and the Harvard yard will have an inventory of allophones or different pronunciations of phonemes that the writing system can capture. And even though that variety of English is spoken differently from English in the Deep South, the writing system will show. I don't know where I'm going with that, so forget that. Sorry, I don't
That's
know what
okay.
point.
No.
What point I was trying to make.
Well, I think that's the argument against the notion that you can solve the problem by fixing the orthography somehow.
Right, that was the point. I knew there was a point there.
Okay.
You can't fix the problem by instituting a phonetic system of spelling, because dialects vary in their pronunciation, so that the system that we've got, which is broadly phonemic, will account for these non-significant variations in England, the United States, Australia, and India.
Right. Well, that's not necessarily an argument for why things are the way they are, or an argument against the fact that they could be improved, but that there's implicitly a limitation on how far any system can go as a pronunciation guide, given the variations in dialect.
Exactly. There is an intrinsic limitation on how far reforms can be made because of differences in dialect, both within a country and globally.
Excellent. Good.
I would also say that kind of going ahead to the 16th century, in the 1560s, the 1570s, and the 1580s, there were several problems that exercised scholars of the English language that were parallel to problems that exercised scholars in the other vernacular languages in Europe. One was the establishment of English in fields in which Latin especially had been supreme. This was a common problem throughout Europe. Another was the introduction of new words and what to do with words that the learned people could understand, but the mass of people could not. And a third was the reform of the spelling, which of course is the main topic that we have before us. And there were some very serious attempts in the 1580s to reform English spelling. Most of these failed because they went too far. There were too many diacritics, too many little hooks and accents, and the problem that reformers have always run up against is the conservatism of people who have learned a system which seems fine to the people who have learned it and who seem to have no need to change. So therefore, to put in a radically different system of spelling is going to upset people who have already learned their system. Doesn't have much of a chance. William Bullocker wrote a book at large for the Amendment of Orthography, published in 1562. Too many hooks, too many diacritics. Nobody wanted to bother with it. Richard Mulcaster proposed more modest changes. He was more commonsensical, had a better idea of how the language should develop. He didn't have great success in spelling reform. Fast forwarding ahead again, Noah Webster, at first rejecting the idea of spelling reform, then embracing Ben Franklin's idea of the need to reform English spelling, went too far in one direction, and then by the time he published his first small dictionary had retrenched, and the changes that he made which we still have, dropping the K on words like music and logic, and dropping the U in honor and glory, and using ER instead of RE in center and theater. Half a dozen changes that have become part of American spelling. Some of those have also become part of British spelling.
That's great. Gosh, I think I'm pretty close to complete and happy. As I reflect for a moment, what haven't we talked about that's important? I mean, obviously, you could spend forever talking about that question, but...
Okay, here's something.
Good.
Okay.
Are you okay? You needing a break, a movement, or anything? You're all right?
No, I'm fine.
Good.
Dr. Johnson wrote a great dictionary, published in 2 volumes in the year 1755. The effect that Johnson had on the language is often overrated, as was his originality, because he was drawing on a century and a half of lexicography in which the main trait was plagiarizing from the people who went before. So the history of lexicography is a history of plagiarism. Johnson just did it better than anyone had done it up to that time. But most of the features of his dictionary had appeared in dictionaries before his. It was a very important occasion, the publication of his Dictionary of the English Language. In a way, it set back lexicography because lesser lights were hesitant to rush in and try to surpass Johnson. But if there was a century and a half tradition, that means that the first dictionary was published in the year 1604 by Robert Cowdrey. We would hardly call it a dictionary. It was a slim word list. Now, if you think of the year 1604, and if you think of Shakespeare writing his plays, he got along perfectly well without a dictionary for 3/4 of his career. In 1604, he was writing his great tragedies. Maybe he was writing King Lear on the day that Cowdrey's Table Alphabetical was published. So Shakespeare did not need to refer to the dictionary for spelling or meaning or synonyms. This is something that we might bear in mind when we try to evaluate the effect that dictionaries have on the development or arresting the development of the language. Dr. Johnson's original aim was to arrest the development, to slow it down. And in his preface to his dictionary, he very eloquently explains that he has been chastened in this endeavor to enchain syllables and to lash the wind are equally the undertakings of folly and pride. Johnson had no illusions that his dictionary would stop changes in the language.
But he created a standard that would retard the rate of change.
He created a standard that had an effect, that people could refer to. It would probably be difficult to show as precisely as one could for, say, Noah Webster and his sets of spelling changes, exactly the changes that Johnson caused. But people have tried. Either the changes that he caused or the changes that he thwarted.
Well, anytime you have some kind of a standard reference point, that's going to conserve changes with respect to the people that use it for the things that are referenced, right?
Whenever there's a standard reference work, it will retard changes for the people who use it. But that's the catch. How many people use the dictionary on a regular basis? And we have to take ourselves out of the setting that we're in. You and I reach for the dictionary several times a day.
Or click.
Or now we click.
Yeah. Okay. Back to Shakespeare for a moment. In some respects, because there wasn't a dictionary, and perhaps even if there was, he didn't use it, he wouldn't have used it, is why the same word could be spelled, multiple different ways across the scope of his work, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that was the case with Shakespeare.
Right. Yeah. We don't have Shakespeare's manuscripts. We just have the first folio and the quartos, and we don't know what he actually did.
We don't know
what he did. We don't know
but the
exactly.
first versions we do have
right.
these variations.
Multiple, various spellings. And sometimes the printers would just justify a line by taking in a letter or putting in a letter.
That segues us right into our next point, which is I want to talk about the printing press. We had a great conversation on the phone about the printing press, and it's a next step up of where we left the chancery.
Yeah.
Of technicians coming in from, other than English, not necessarily speaking or hearing all the distinctions in English, and yet deciding, how to spell to some degree, and because of the cost of fonts, just leaving out some characters that had previously evolved to represent some of these sounds. I want you to take your time as much as you're comfortable with and really take us through the effect of the printing press on spelling, on the language, and the absurdities involved in the conventions that got into it.
Right. Caxton, of course, was a businessman. He wasn't just a scholar. He wanted to make money on his dictionary. Start over. Caxton was a businessman. He wasn't a scholar. He wanted to make money on his books. And in order to make money on his books, they had to reach the largest possible audience. So he gave a great deal of thought about who that audience might be, and the fact that English, as both a written and a spoken language, was highly variable at this time. And he has some lovely anecdotes of merchants misunderstanding what is being asked for, and people being insulted, and a wife trying to buy eggs, and the merchant can't understand her, and she says, "I don't speak any French," and so it makes for a kind of situation comedy in these misunderstandings that Caxton recapitulated. So he wanted to publish in a dialect that would reach the largest number of people. It so happens that his press was in London. London was the largest city in England. It was part of a dialect region that was the largest dialect region in England, the East Midland dialect. That happens to be the dialect at an earlier stage that Chaucer wrote in. So ultimately, the facts of demography will determine spelling, I think, indirectly, so that as Caxton decided on one form and then another, he was able to replicate in hundreds, thousands of copies this form, and to freeze that form to some extent, while the great vowel shift was still in progress, while changes in pronunciation were still going on.
You once said in our last conversation that this was a brilliant point that I want to really make here, which was that the printing press came in at the wrong time. I mean, you just referred to that in what you said, but I want to be more explicit about that.
Right. Okay, let me just frame that. Yeah, among the generalizations that can be made about the 15th century is that as regards to the language, in many ways, it was a radical century. New words were coming in. People were traveling to Europe. New fashions were in need of new names. And among the internal linguistic changes, the great vowel shift was in mid-stride. When Caxton began printing in 1476, it's as though he took a photograph of the language in mid-stride and captured it at that moment, given irregularities in his own system of spelling. But it was just at the wrong moment to freeze English. It was neither the pronunciation of a century before or the pronunciation that developed a century later into modern English. So it is interesting that the printing press came in at a time when the language was changing as rapidly as we have ever known it to change.
So it was really an unstable. It was in an unstable state, so to speak.
English was in an unstable state among the different regions of the country and among the different levels of society at this time. Highly unstable. And what he did was to stabilize one particular dialect, and that has become, along with other reasons, because of his influence, the international variety of written English today.
Yeah. Excellent. So we could say that there's a series of critical milestones that we've been talking about today, and that we could go all the way back to I forget the 466 date or whatever it was when the Germans warring warriors come across the
449. Yeah,
449.
July 17th. Or April 17th.
There you go. To King Alfred, to William the Conqueror.
Yeah.
To King Henry V.
Right.
To the Great Vowel Shift.
Right.
To Caxton.
Right.
And to the, you'd almost, I don't know what would come next, probably jumping to Johnson or something. I don't know where you'd go next, but these were kind of these major moments of undulation. Could we link them all together in one group?
Let me see what I can do with that. Yeah.
Excuse me, one other piece that needs to be in there, right?
Yeah.
Is King James.
Right.
Right? The King James Bible now puts all these pieces that came before it into this is what we're going to read now, folks.
Right.
Which creates the biggest readership, which then standardizes things.
Right, yeah. Good. So if we were to name the greatest hits in the history of the English language, we would start with those boatloads of Germans who came over in 449, Germanic warriors who came to the aid of the Romanized Celts. That would be the beginning of English. After that, we can think of what happened at the time of the Norman Conquest, bringing in especially the influx of French vocabulary, but also accelerating some changes that were in progress actually before the Norman Conquest. Those changes were highly important for the grammar of the language. They were the loss of grammatical inflections. Old English was a highly inflected language. In late Old English, in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, there began to be a collapse of some of these endings on words to show the dative case or the genitive plural. And when the Norman Conquest occurred, and there was no standardized written English, these changes accelerated. Finally, the only grammatical inflections that were left were the final E, still with us as the silent E, although pronounced in 14th century English by Chaucer. And during the decades after Chaucer, that too was lost. During those same decades after Chaucer, the great vowel shift was in progress, changing the long vowels in English, generally causing them to be pronounced higher or the high vowels to become diphthongs. So here we have a mix of external and internal forces on the language from the beginning to the loss of inflections, to the imposition of French, to the loss of even a remnant of an inflection in the final E. Then, as people become conscious of the language and want to change it, to reform it, especially in the latter part of the 16th century, scholars looked around and saw that spelling was in a bad way, and so attempts were made to reform the spelling of the English language. Most of these proposals didn't get anywhere because they were too radical. But a few decades after that, Shakespeare was writing in English, and by 1611 we had the authorized version of the Bible, two very important milestones in the development of English. But despite the achievement of Shakespeare and the committee that wrote the King James translation of the Bible, there was dissatisfaction with English because it seemed to have no rules. And sure enough, it didn't have the dictionaries and the grammars that the classical languages had. So there was a call for an academy during especially the late 17th and the early 18th centuries. France had the Académie Française, Italy had the Accademia della Crusca. There was no academy in England to regulate the language, to retard growth, and to shape it in the ways that it should go. Well, for various reasons, even though some very serious proposals were made, including by Jonathan Swift in the second decade of the 18th century, these did not come to fruition. And then the function of an academy was fulfilled, in any case, by the publication of dictionaries, culminating especially in Johnson's dictionary in 1755, and by the publication of grammars, mainly prescriptive grammars, about the same time, the middle of the 18th century. So that with the publication of Johnson's dictionary and grammars that said what was right and what was wrong in English, and God knows how these grammarians had their insights into what ought to be, but they wrote them down with great authority. English, after the late 18th century, settled into the kind of stability that is familiar to us now, so that we read the language of the 19th century or the early 20th century. We recognize changes in style, but it's a familiar language. From the 18th century, there haven't been these changes in phonology or morphology or lexicon that characterize the earlier periods of the language.
That's attribution of a superiority to Latin that pulled their thinking
Right.
into a kind of snooty Latinish attitude,
Right.
like with
Yeah.
split infinitives,
Exactly.
that really misled the direction of English because of their misplaced preferences towards Latin.
Right. Of the two authorities in the latter part of the 18th century, Johnson was just a great person. He had a great mind. He wrote a great dictionary. People should be in awe of Samuel Johnson. The authors of grammars were not in Johnson's league. Bishop Robert Louth, for example, published a short introduction to English grammar in 1762. And his mind and his work are just of a lower quality than Johnson's. But with grammars, once something is written down, it seems to be the law. And then it's repeated by the next grammarian. And the reason often given for a rule is that it accords with Latin usage. And of course, English should never have been thought to need to conform to Latin usage, or by some kind of spurious logic, such as the proscription against the double negative, so that supposedly two negatives cancel each other out and you get a positive. And if I ask you if I can borrow $1 and you say, I ain't got no dough, and I say, ain't got no, two negatives, that means you have some money. Good. Could I borrow $1 then, since you obviously have some money? Well, you would think that I I was the fool that I am for doing that kind of calculation. Other languages, closely related languages, use the double negative to enforce for emphasis. Whereas some grammarian, it might have been Louth or it might have been another one writing about the time of Louth, said, well, they cancel each other out, avoid double negatives. A lot of these very superficial rules of the grammarians are just that. They're like rules of etiquette, knowing which fork to use. Because if you choose the wrong fork, well, then you will obviously belong to the wrong class, and you're not going to be able to have the kind of upward mobility that we all aspire to. But most of these prescriptive rules are just about at the level of rules of table etiquette.
Yeah, except yeah, I think that's a great analogy. And they're still saying, cautioning us on split infinitives and double negatives.
Right.
When I was in school.
Right.
Right. So these things that were, ridiculous at one level have become entrenched in the propagation.
Yeah, these superficial rules become entrenched. People have resisted them. I have changed my own usage. I have long since given up avoiding a preposition at the end of a sentence. A famous statement by Winston Churchill when one of his aides moved the preposition from the end of the sentence to somewhere safely in the middle of it. Churchill wrote, "This is the kind of impertinence up with which I shall not put." Split infinitives are fine with me too. More recently, there was a time when I avoided split infinitives. I've come to live with split infinitives. There's the joke about the Texan who went to Harvard and saw a Harvard man walking across Harvard Yard, Harvard Square, and said, "Excuse me, sir, could you tell me where the library is at?" And the Harvard man said, "Well, at Harvard, we don't end sentences with a preposition." And the Texan said, "Excuse me, sir, could you tell me where the library is at, asshole?" I don't expect you to use that.
That's great. That's going to be a great highlight jewel.
No, that's not for...
Oh, great. Okay. One more pass through. You doing all right?
Yeah.
You starting to wipe out?
I'm getting a little giddy, as you can tell.
If you want to take a break, I think we can be done in 10 or 12 minutes, something like that.
No, I can stay with it.
If you're up to that? Okay, good. Thank you. Historical accidents. I want to do another cut through our storyline here. And just, we did this when we talked on the phone. The whimsical, fortuitous, bizarre intersections that caused the forging of this language, rather than as you mentioned before, there was no committee. I mean, there was not a bunch of people saying, wow, like the reformers attempted, like Webster's spirit was pushing towards, or Franklin's. There was nobody saying, well, wait a minute, hundreds of millions of people are going to be using this thing in the future. It's going to be a global language. It's going to affect the culture of the planet. We should be really careful with this thing. We should be very thoughtful. We should, today we should convene a World Congress of neuroscientists and cognitive scientists and linguists and shift it. There's none of that. There's a series of, the printing press comes in at this particular time. The scribes are trained this particular way. The grammarians come in with Latin biases. There's a series of accidents, neither God ordained nor intelligently worked out, that are involved in the evolved structure of all of this. And if you remember some of our conversation about this on the phone, that's what I'm trying to capture now.
Right. Yeah, there have been sporadic attempts to regulate the language.
Would you repeat that just when I...
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. There have been sporadic attempts to regulate the language, as with the spelling reformers in the 16th century and with Samuel Johnson in the 18th century. Most of these are operating after the fact. The language has already developed in ways almost inexorable that it's going to develop in. So that there was never a committee, not even an academy. The efforts for an English academy failed. To the extent that an academy can be successful, England didn't have one. So it was by a series of accidents, first of all, that the variety that we now know as International Standard English developed in London in the late 14th century. And this had to do mainly with reasons of population, demography, the government being in London, the printing press being in London, and London being the largest city, East Midland region being the largest area. If all of those had been features of Lancaster, would be speaking a different kind of international English today. So one point to bear in mind is that the development of English is certainly a series of historical accidents. It's contingent upon what happened at a certain time, not any planning. There's never been any planning for English. There have been sporadic attempts to rectify what were seen as deficiencies in the language to retard change. But certainly in spelling, where one could say a reasonable, logical approach might have avoided some of the problems that we have now, there was never a committee, there was never a plan for English spelling. There was always a kind of series of reactions to historical events.